The life of Swedish painter Eugen Napoleon Nicolaus Bernadotte was complicated. He belonged to the cohort of anti-establishment artists seeking liberation from the suffocatingly rigid standards of the Stockholm Academy, established in 1735 during the reign of Frederick I. At the same time, he was the youngest son of King Oscar II and Queen Sophia, Prince of Sweden and Norway, and Duke of Närke, a position that dramatically limited the things he could do and say in public. He remained unmarried, and his romantic life, if there was one, is shrouded in mystery. His closest relationship, aside from his artist colleagues, was with the Danish writer Helena Nyblom, daughter of the Danish Golden Age painter Eugen and wife of his Uppsala University aesthetics professor Carl Rupert Nyblom. With them, Prince Eugen found his chosen family. Hi, I'm Michelle Fakos. I've been lecturing and writing about Nordic art for decades, and I'm both a Swedish and an American citizen living part-time in Stockholm. I'm excited to share with you my research, gleaned from books, journals, letters, and conversations with other experts. I know how hard it is to find out about Nordic art because I had to learn to read Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and German to do it. Are you with me? Let's continue. As fourth in line to the throne, Prince Eugen enjoyed the luxury of not having to concern himself with preparations to rule. He was, however, destined for a military career, a career that did not interest him in the least. His attraction to the life of an artist embroiled him in a personal struggle, civic duty versus personal fulfillment, that troubled him for decades. Like many members of the nobility, Eugen received piano and drawing lessons as a child, but discovered his passion for drawing during a trip around the Mediterranean made following his graduation from high school, where he prepared for a career in the Swedish military. He continued his officer training at Uppsala University for a year in 1885-86, and also there began formal art studies with the renowned academic painters Wilhelm von Geierfeldt and Hans Gude. Gude encouraged the prince to study nature and to paint outdoors, in contradiction to the Stockholm Academy's advice to conform to pre-established formulas for landscape painting. In the fall of 1887, and with the reluctant blessing of his parents, Prince Eugen joined the vibrant colony of Nordic expatriate artists working in Paris. He traveled under an assumed name, Monsieur Oscarsson, in order to escape socializing in the aristocratic circles that would otherwise have been expected of someone in his position. Like many of his artist colleagues, Monsieur Oscarsson studied in the private studio of Léon Bonnat, and when that closed 6 months later, he moved to that of the highly respected academic painter Henri Gervex. The status of these two artists, accomplished and well-established in the Parisian art community, enhanced the possibility of their students meeting the stringent criteria of the Paris Salon jury, the gatekeeper of the longest regularly occurring art exhibition in the Western world. Appreciative of parental support, Prince Eugen fully intended to excel both as a cavalry officer and as a painter. Nonetheless, his status as a member of the royal family generated an inner conflict. He found himself in complete sympathy with the Swedish expat artists community, which had adopted a vehemently anti-establishment position, anti to the establishment in which Prince Eugen himself was a high-ranking member. The opponents, as they initially called themselves, chose red as the background for their logo, which then as now was associated with the socialist labor movement. The opponents did, in fact, consider themselves laborers because they worked with their hands, even if most of them came from the upper echelons of society. And, like their artisanal and factory working compatriots, the opponents were determined to be productive, useful, and patriotic members of Swedish society. Despite his privileged position, Prince Eugen had experienced at first hand the frustration of a narrow pedagogical approach that focused on the human body and the virtual absence of opportunities to show one's work to the public. Prince Eugen was nothing if not a passionate patriot, and he shared the enthusiasm of his compatriots to create a uniquely Swedish national school of art, one that would promote social solidarity and love of their Swedish homeland. To Eugen, this seemed the arena of patriotic public service in which he could make the most significant contribution. To accomplish this objective, these opponents, these national romantics, as they called themselves, needed to identify Sweden's most singular characteristics and paint them in a manner that fostered emotional attachment. Through extensive readings in psychology, collegial discussions, and periodic visits home, Swedish national romantics settled on nature as the most important subject and the diurnal and climatic extremes of that northern country as the focus of interest, as you see in this selection of paintings by national romantic opponent artists. Their ambition contrasted dramatically with Sweden's lackluster cultural situation in the 1880s. The biggest problem was that the only viable art education occurred either at the Royal Academy in Stockholm or in the studios of professors teaching at it, a situation that offered a very narrow curriculum with rigid performance standards. The other impediment was the fact that nowhere in Sweden were exhibitions held regularly, which, combined with the virtual non-existence of art galleries, meant that artists had enormous difficulty reaching their public. Prince Eugen quietly, yet determinedly, allied himself with the renegade opponents, who formed the Swedish Artists' Union in 1885. He, too, believed in the need for reform of the Art Academy's curriculum if it were to remain relevant to the increasingly divergent demands of the contemporary art market. He also felt the same patriotic call as other artists' unionists to create a singularly and clearly recognizable school of Swedish art, such as that developed during the Danish Golden Age in the second quarter of the 19th century. Eugen's position as a Swedish royal prevented his actively participating in the anti-establishment secessionist movement afoot in Paris during the mid-1880s by Swedish artists, under the leadership of Ernst Josephson, although he clearly sympathized with them. He even went so far as to participate, albeit anonymously, in the Swedish art section of the 1889 Paris World's Fair, which was organized by the secessionist Artists' Union, because Sweden, like all other European monarchies, refused to participate officially in the event, since the fair commemorated the centennial of the French Revolution, which, for a time, did away with the French monarchy. Among the works Eugen painted as he awaited the World's Fair opening was a springtime view of a village near Chantilly, in which he created a composition evenly balanced between earth and sky, and populated by whitewashed stone walls and red tile roofs, a sight one would never encounter in Sweden, but which was common in the Ile-de-France region. He faithfully captured the moisture-heavy atmosphere of northern France while visiting his friend, Monsieur Amique. In a letter to his mother, the prince confided, quote, "It is restorative to be back in the countryside again, especially when one comes from Paris with all its commotion. Here, the landscape is beautiful, and I paint a lot," end quote. At some point, while visiting Monsieur Amique, Prince Eugen undoubtedly made a pilgrimage to the Château of Chantilly in order to view the stunning art collection there. It's also the place where whipped cream was invented. During his Paris years, Prince Eugen spent summers painting in the Swedish and Norwegian countrysides, where he focused on figure studies on the advice of his teachers. Understandably, he imitated the compositional formula of the immensely popular French salon painter Jules Bastien Lepage, who focused his sympathetic attention on peasants, often placing them on a tipped-up ground with no or little sky visible. We see Eugen adopting a similar strategy in Young Woman from Valdres, but here he bathes the scene in the intense sunlight of Nordic summer, which creates dramatic highlights on the young woman's blonde hair and on the white picket fence behind her. Here the prince seems more attentive to the singular character of the Nordic landscape, where the subject stands in a visibly mountainous setting, whose undulating contours are separated by a river. Prince Eugen strove increasingly to identify and capture the singular aspects of the Nordic countryside, especially the feelings of humidity, of the sun, the smells of pine and wild strawberries, and sounds, fish jumping, nightingales singing, of the forest. He spent the summer of 1889 with his mother in the wilderness region of Valdres, Norway, where she had rented a farm. In a letter written to Helena Nyblom in July 1889, Prince Eugen confided, "It's so peaceful here, far from civilization. The air vibrates with silence and shifts from cool to warm, from stars to sunlight. Every evening I'm out, painting or just observing and enjoying nature. Everything becomes so monumental and simple at twilight." In that same letter to Nyblom, the prince confessed, quote, "Now, when I think about the works I painted in Paris, they seem to me products of over-refinement, at least in comparison to the healthy, robust nature here," end quote. Indeed, in this painting, we find a freshness and vitality, a passion absent from Eugen's French landscapes. In addition to the experiments of his colleagues, it was the observations of French critics at the 1889 Paris World's Fair that helped direct Prince Eugen toward the path he was seeking. They expressed particular enthusiasm for Norwegian painting, above all, Erik Werenskiold's Peasant Burial. Critics admired the fact that the image was incontestably un-French because of its forest-blanketed mountain landscape, intense sunlight, and the quiet dignity and singular dress of this grieving group, qualities found in Prince Eugen's painting from the summer of 1889. Prince Eugen continued to be troubled by the fact that most people, including his own family, considered his painting a charming pastime rather than a serious occupation. In a letter to his mother written in May 1890, the prince admitted that, quote, "I have no interest in pursuing a military career, despite my best efforts to do so. To be a bad officer is very unsatisfying, but to devote more effort to it would mean a farewell to painting, end quote. A year later, in response to a letter from the prince, Helena Neublum responded, quote, I understand completely what the prince says about himself. When one was small, one believed that as an adult, one could do as one wished. Now I understand that adults have much less freedom than toddlers, and that the prince understandably lives under a particularly narrow set of restrictions, end quote. Prince Eugen spent the summer of 1890 with his mother in Norway, where he painted Moonrise in Valdres. This painting marks a turning point in his career because it documents the moment when he abandoned the advice of his teachers, who counseled him to concentrate on images of people, and turned his attention exclusively to landscape and to scenes that for him, and for most Swedes, had an especially intense resonance. Directly behind the prince and opposite the rising full moon, the sun is setting. Twilight is one of the most impressive diurnal events of the far north, because in summer it lasts for hours, and the sky never becomes completely dark, although the earth does. From this point onward, Prince Eugen became the premier portrayer of the central Swedish landscape, just as Niels Kruger was the master of the Öland landscape and Gustav Fjestad the master of winter in the forests of Värmland. In acknowledgement of his debt to his teacher, the great Norwegian landscape painter Hans Gude, the prince presented Moonrise in Valdres to him in 1895 on his 70th birthday. When Gude died in 1903, Prince Eugen purchased the painting from Gude's estate and returned it to his collection, which was housed at his estate, Valdemarsudde, where it resides today. In Stockholm, Prince Eugen felt himself at the epicenter of a momentous transcultural movement, National Romanticism. Since the institution of 7 years of compulsory education for boys and girls in 1842, enthusiasm accelerated for the creation of a generic national identity that all could embrace. It inspired bureaucrats, the Artists' Union, writers like Verner von Heidenstam and August Strindberg, composers like Hugo Alphén, art collectors like Prince Eugen and Ernst Thiel, and philosophers like Ellen Key. When he returned to Stockholm, Prince Eugen lived with his brother in the so-called Crown Prince's Palace, a bridge away from the royal palace, where his parents lived. He rented a separate studio where he often entertained his artist friends. The prince spent summers in the countryside where he enjoyed a freedom from obligations that for him never could exist in Stockholm. In the spring of 1891, the prince rented a manor property named Ballingsta, just south of Stockholm. He invited there as his guest the sculptor Theodor Lundberg, who later married Ellen Neublum, the daughter of Helena. There in Ballingsta, Prince Eugen painted Spring, which he gave to Lundberg as a souvenir of their summer together. The choice of a portrait format emphasized the verticality of the slender birches. Although no humans appear, a group of buildings across the lake hint at their presence. A few months after he painted it, he felt that its plentiful details undermined the sense of harmony he strove to achieve. Around this time, Prince Eugen was feeling an uncomfortable degree of coercion to conform to royal family expectations. His oldest brother, Crown Prince Gustav, was married with 3 children, and his second oldest brother had made himself ineligible for the throne by marrying a non-aristocrat. Eugen and his sickly younger brother Karl remained unmarried, and there was pressure on Eugen to find himself a princess. Although several steps away from the throne, he could possibly become king one day, in which case finding a suitable future queen was essential, a situation Eugen found extremely stressful. His father had also been an unlikely candidate for king when he was Eugen's age, his parents argued. This was also a reason that his father refused to release Eugen from his military duties, the proper preparation for a future king. In 1906, a caricaturist envisioned how the reign of Prince Eugen in Sweden might look. In the summer of 1892, Prince Eugen rented another farm, Fjällskifte, south of Stockholm. Lundberg joined him again and worked on his commission for Uppsala Cathedral. Oscar Björk, who was working on a ceiling painting at the time, came for a few weeks and painted the prince's portrait during the evenings, while Lundberg read aloud from Emile Zola's novel Germinal. On that property was a magnificent forest, which Eugen captured at twilight. During this time, he thought a lot about the power of art. In a letter to Helena Newblom, he declared that music was the finest among the arts, and that, quote, painters have the right to liberate themselves from rationality just as much as composers do, without being accused of insanity. I am so sick of everything rational at the moment. Maybe that's because of all the political intrigue relating to Norway's struggle for independence. All feeling must be eradicated, apparently, end quote. In the forest, Prince Eugen conveys the feeling of being alone in a forest during the long summer twilight. The intense rays of the setting sun redden the bark of the fir trees, and we stand in the humid stillness, inhaling the aromatic trees and listening, perhaps, to the nightingale's song. Inspired by Werner von Heidenstam's newly published novel Hans Alienus, that summer Eugen also painted Where the Forest Glows, imagining the moment when the protagonist of the novel returns home at sunset after years of wandering, apparently in wintertime. Prince Eugen envisioned the moment the wandering hero first sees the contours of his beloved home through the spindly trees, the sky ablaze, reflecting the emotional state of the wanderer. It conveys a similar sense of solitude in nature to the forest, a tranquil, contemplative feeling with which all Swedes are familiar. In 1893, Sundbyholm Manor provided the inspiration for the Old Palace, which the prince felt approached the emotional intensity of a Chopin scherzo. In his memoir, Prince Eugen confessed that this image expressed tremendous suffering, ending, as he described it, like a scream. Without an understanding of the artist's intention, one might well interpret the scene as a celebration of the long, light days of summer, when a mix of cumulus and cirrus clouds float in a brilliant blue sky. Compared to spring, which 2 years earlier he felt was too busy to evoke a strong emotion, the large blocks of color here, with the orange tones of the old palace's tile roof echoed in the meadow, conveyed, as the prince believed, a better developed sense of harmony. His Norwegian colleagues Erik Werenskjöld and Gerhard Munthe agreed, but his compatriot Georg Pauli complained that the intense saturation of the blues and reds were too strong. The Swedish art critic Klaus Foreus, on the other hand, experienced a profound sentiment for the historical significance of Swedish manners. In the final decades of the 19th century, artists were beginning to understand that perception was, to a great degree, subjective and shaped by a constellation of factors that included genetics and social conditioning. This realization would play a key role in 20th century art movements like Expressionism and Surrealism. Since the summer of 1890, the New Blooms had spent their summers on the property of Tyresö Manor, now in a southern suburb of Stockholm. Helena pestered the prince to join them, a congenial group that included Theodor Lundberg, who married Helena's daughter Ellen in 1893. After short visits and several years of searching, the prince found a summer cottage there in the summer of 1894. There he took up his most famous subject, clouds. In a letter to Carl Larsson written in September 1893, the prince confessed, quote, "I have had trouble with clouds this summer. They disappear just when they are best. You know, those huge white fluffy clouds that shimmer in such a way that they can completely destroy one's senses," end quote. He painted at least 6 versions of the cloud between 1895 and 1941. Prince Eugen's attraction to clouds may have stemmed from his personal sense of rootlessness, a consequence of not belonging fully to either the aristocratic world into which he was born, with all its constraints and responsibilities, or to the dynamic, socially engaged world of his artist union friends. This version predates the famous one from 1896 and was considered lost for decades. It was given as a gift by the prince to his godson, Bengt, the elder son of Ellen and Theodor Lundberg. Bengt brought it with him when he emigrated to the U.S. in the 1920s, and in 2008 it turned up at an auction house in Delray Beach, Florida. It is still housed in its original frame. The arched format almost seems created by the billowing cloud that rests atop Tyresö Church and presses skyward. In 1896, he transformed this relatively straightforward landscape into a mysterious image. The narrow path that leads us into the scene disappears over the edge of the hill, suggesting a more metaphysical theme. Although we all trod particular paths in life, our destinations always remain uncertain. The second-generation National Romantic painter Hermann Norman was so enchanted by the prince's cloud paintings that he drew inspiration from them when painting a cloud subject from his home in northern Sweden in 1900. Clouds were also a popular subject among National Romantic poets. Prince Eugen owned a well-worn and annotated copy of Werner von Heidenstam's 1899 poetry collection, Pilgrimage and Wandering Years, which included a poem entitled The Cloud, with the lines, quote, "I want to build my house on clouds. Skies, show me a path that leads up to your field of light," end quote. Always trying to figure out acceptable ways of promoting culture and the values of social democracy, the egalitarian democratic political platform that guided Swedish society in the 20th century. The prince supported several of his colleagues by purchasing their work, serving on the boards of handicraft associations, and making monumental paintings for public venues like schools and churches. Inspired by the French muralist Pierre Puvis de Chavannes and by Helena Nyblom's 1890 poem Summer Night, Prince Eugen completed a huge painting for the auditorium of Stockholm's North Latin School for Boys. It depicts his summer paradise in Tyresö. In his copy of Leo Tolstoy's essay, What is Art?, Prince Eugen underlined the sentence, quote, "Belief in the restorative, toughening force of nature gives meaning to life," end quote. And in explaining his choice of motif for this site-specific project, the prince stated, quote, "I want to do something authentically Swedish, with black fir trees and glistening water, to give an impression of tranquility and seriousness, something I think would be good for the boys to look at and understand," end quote. If you enjoyed this content, please hit the thumbs up button and check out my other Nordic art videos. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to keep current with new videos and want to do a good deed today and support this project. Leave comments and questions in the section below, and check out my website for related articles, books, lectures, and blog posts. What would you like to learn about Scandinavian art?